A medieval woman might spend over 3,000 hours a year just spinning wool into thread. She could expect to give birth multiple times, with each childbirth carrying a roughly 1 in 20 chance of her own death. The simple act of getting enough water for her family could mean hours of heavy lifting every single day. Her most treasured possessions might all fit into one small wooden box, and that box was a major part of her identity. Number 12. The humble rushlight or tallow candle. Imagine a world where, for much of the year, darkness fell early and stayed late. This was the reality for most medieval women. The primary source of artificial light in an ordinary home was the rushlight. To make one, a woman would gather rushes, which are common marsh plants with long, pithy stems. She would peel away most of the outer green layer, leaving a single strip to support the absorbent pith. Then this prepared rush was carefully dipped into melted animal fat, any leftover grease from cooking, known as tallow. Once the fat cooled and solidified, the rushlight was ready. It didn't produce a bright, steady flame like a modern candle. Instead, it offered a dim, flickering, often smoky and smelly light. A typical rushlight, perhaps 12 to 18 inches long, might only burn for 15 to 30 minutes, depending on its thickness and the quality of the fat. This meant that if light was needed for an extended period, many rushlights would have to be prepared and used in succession. They were often held in simple metal clips or propped against a stone. Tallow candles, made from molded animal fat with a proper wick, were an improvement. They burned longer and a bit brighter than rushlights, but they were also more costly in terms of the amount of precious fat they consumed. Making tallow candles involved rendering down significant quantities of fat, purifying it to some extent, and then repeatedly dipping a wick or pouring the tallow into a mold. For most families, these were used sparingly. Beeswax candles gave the best light, clear, steady, and sweet-smelling. But beeswax was expensive, mostly produced by monasteries or large estates, and generally reserved for the church or very wealthy households. For the average medieval woman, the dim glow of a rushlight or a single tallow candle was all that stood between her family and complete darkness after sunset. Tasks that required good light, like fine sewing or reading, for the very few who could, were difficult or impossible. The cost of fuel for light, whether the time spent gathering rushes and processing fat, or the actual expense of candles, meant that light was used only when absolutely necessary. Evening hours were often spent in near darkness, perhaps with just the glow from the hearth fire providing minimal illumination. The risk of fire from these open flames was also a constant concern in homes built largely of wood and thatch. The rhythm of the day was dictated by daylight. When the sun went down, most activities ceased, and the long, dark night began. Number 11. The ever-present head covering. Step outside your door in medieval Europe, and you would instantly know a woman's marital status, and often her social standing, simply by looking at her head. For adult women, particularly married women, a head covering was not optional. It was a fundamental part of her attire and public presentation. These coverings came in a variety of forms: wimples, veils, coifs, kerchiefs, and barbettes, among others. The materials varied too, from simple linen or wool for everyday wear by common women, to finer linens, silks, and even decorated nets for those of higher status. A young unmarried girl might go bareheaded or wear her hair in braids. But upon marriage, or sometimes just upon reaching adulthood, covering the hair became a social and often religious expectation. The wimple, for instance, was a piece of cloth draped around the neck and chin, often covering the hair completely, and sometimes worn with a separate veil over the top. A coif was a close-fitting cap, tied under the chin, often made of linen, and could be worn by women of various classes, sometimes under another head covering or by itself for working. Simple kerchiefs, squares or triangles of cloth, were also common. These head coverings served multiple purposes. They were a visible sign of modesty and respectability, in line with prevailing Christian teachings about female deportment. They also helped to keep a woman's hair clean and out of the way, which was practical for daily chores, especially cooking around an open fire. In an era before frequent bathing, managing hair hygiene was important. Head coverings also offered protection from the sun in summer and cold in winter. Putting on some of these head coverings, especially the more elaborate styles worn by wealthier women, could be a complex process involving careful folding, draping, and pinning. Pins, often made of bone, bronze, or iron, were essential accessories. The way a woman wore her head covering, the fabric it was made from, and any embellishments, all communicated messages about her identity. A widow might wear a particular style, often more somber. A wealthy merchant's wife might display her status with a head covering of fine imported linen or even silk, perhaps crisply starched or pleated. For the vast majority of women, however, the head covering was a simple, practical piece of linen or wool worn every day. From the moment she rose until she went to bed, a constant and visible marker of her place in medieval society. It was as essential as her dress, a non-negotiable element of being a woman in public life. Number 10. The indispensable wooden spoon and bowl. In the medieval household, from the peasant's hut to the more comfortable artisan's dwelling, the wooden spoon and bowl were fundamental. These were not items of luxury, but of sheer necessity, the basic tools for consuming the daily meal. Most people owned very few personal possessions, and their eating utensils were typically simple and utilitarian. The spoon was usually carved from wood. Whatever type was locally available and easy to work, like beech, maple, or sycamore. Designs were straightforward. A shallow scoop at one end and a handle, often just a rounded stick, at the other. Some might have a slightly more shaped handle or a deeper bowl, but elaborate carving was uncommon for everyday items. Each family member might have their own spoon, or they might be shared. They were used for stirring the ever-present pottage in the cooking pot and for eating it. Bowls, too, were frequently made of wood, turned on a lathe, if available, or simply hollowed out. These were known as treenware, from treen, an old word for wooden. Pottery bowls were also used, especially in areas with good clay sources, but wooden ones were durable and less likely to break if dropped. An important consideration on an earthen or rough-hewn wooden floor. Metal bowls, such as pewter, were far more expensive and found primarily in wealthier households. Silver or gold was restricted to the nobility and high clergy. Meals were often a communal affair. A large pot of pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, vegetables, and occasionally a bit of meat or fish would be the centerpiece. Each person might dip their spoon into the central pot, or portions might be ladled into individual wooden or pottery bowls. Bread, if available, would be used to sop up the juices. There were no forks for general eating in most of Europe during much of the medieval period. Fingers and spoons did the work. Cleaning these wooden utensils was a challenge. Wood is porous and can absorb liquids and food particles. They would be scrubbed, perhaps with sand or rough grasses, if soap was scarce, and rinsed with water. Over time, wooden spoons and bowls could become stained, retain odors, and even begin to splinter. If a spoon broke or a bowl cracked, it would either be repaired if possible, or a new one would be made. Many men and some women possessed the basic woodworking skills to carve a simple spoon or fashion a rough bowl, making these items largely self-sufficient for many families. The humble wooden spoon and bowl represent the simplicity, resourcefulness, and communal nature of everyday medieval life and sustenance. Number 9. The constant companion, her needle. A medieval woman's needle was rarely idle. This small, pointed tool was one of her most essential possessions, crucial for the creation and maintenance of her family's clothing and household textiles. Needles in the earlier medieval period were often made of bone, bronze, or iron. As steel-making techniques improved, especially from the later medieval period onwards, finer and stronger steel needles became available, though they remained precious. The size and fineness of the needle varied, depending on the task and the fabric. Thread was the needle's partner. This thread was typically linen, spun from flax, or wool, spun from sheep's fleece. Silk thread, imported and expensive, was used by wealthier women or for special ecclesiastical embroideries. The woman herself, or other women in her household or community, would have spent countless hours spinning these fibers into usable thread using a distaff and spindle, or later, a spinning wheel. The primary task for the needle was mending. Clothing was valuable. Most people owned very few garments, perhaps one or two working kirtles, or tunics, an undershift, and some stockings or hose. These clothes were worn daily and subjected to hard wear. Tears, rips, and worn patches were not reasons to discard a garment, but to repair it. A woman would painstakingly darn socks, patch elbows, and reinforce seams to extend the life of every piece of cloth. Beyond mending, the needle was used to sew new garments from scratch. Fabric itself was the result of much labor, growing or raising the fiber, processing it, spinning it, and then weaving it. So when new clothes were made, patterns were designed to waste as little cloth as possible, often using simple rectangular or triangular shapes. All sewing was done by hand, stitch by stitch. For some women, particularly those in more affluent households or those with leisure time, the needle was also a tool for artistic expression through embroidery. Clothing, household linens like tablecloths or bed hangings for the wealthy, and ecclesiastical vestments could be adorned with intricate stitch designs. This decorative needlework could display status, piety, or simply a love of beauty. Some women even earned an income as professional embroiderers. Working with a needle, especially for fine tasks or by the dim light of a rushlight or winter window, required good eyesight and considerable skill. Thimbles, sometimes made of leather or metal, helped to protect the finger pushing the needle. Scissors, or small shears, were used for cutting thread and fabric. But they too were valuable tools, not always readily available to everyone. The needle, then, was far more than just a sliver of metal or bone. It was a symbol of a woman's domestic responsibility, her skill, her thrift, and sometimes her artistry. It was a constant presence in her work basket and in her hands. Number 8. The lifeline, her water bucket. For a medieval woman, water was life, and obtaining it was a daily, often arduous chore. The water bucket or pail was a constant companion in this never-ending task. These buckets were typically made of wooden staves, like a small barrel, bound together with hoops of wood, or if the household could afford it, iron. They varied in size, but even a moderately sized bucket, when full of water, could weigh 30 to 40 pounds or more. The journey to the water source was a regular part of a woman's, or her daughter's, brew and routine. Few individual homes had their own wells, especially in rural areas or poorer urban districts. The communal village well, a nearby stream, river, or even a spring was where water had to be fetched. This could mean a walk of several hundred yards or, in some cases, much farther, often over uneven or muddy paths. And one trip was rarely enough. Water was needed for drinking, for cooking the daily pottage, for washing hands and faces. Full baths were infrequent, for cleaning cooking pots and utensils, for laundry, a major periodic task, and sometimes for animals or small-scale brewing of ale. A household could easily require many gallons of water each day. This meant multiple trips back and forth, carrying heavy, sloshing buckets. Women often carried one bucket in each hand for balance, or a single larger bucket, or used a wooden yoke across their shoulders to distribute the weight of 2 pails. The physical strain was immense, especially on the back, shoulders, and arms. Spills were common, meaning lost effort, and sometimes a wet, cold journey. In winter, paths could be icy and treacherous, making the task even more dangerous. The quality of the water obtained was also a constant concern, though medieval people may not have understood germ theory as we do. River or stream water could be contaminated by animal waste, upstream or by local human activities. Even well water wasn't always pure. This had direct implications for the health of the family. The water bucket therefore symbolized one of the most laborious and essential aspects of a medieval woman's daily existence. It represented hours of her time and a significant expenditure of her physical energy, all to provide the most basic necessity for her family's survival and well-being. There were no taps to turn, no convenient indoor plumbing for the vast majority. There was only the woman, her bucket, and the long walk to water. Number 7. The unseen power of keys. In a medieval household, particularly one of some substance, a jangling bunch of keys was a potent symbol, and often they hung from the belt of the woman of the house. These keys were not just bits of iron or bronze. They represented authority, responsibility, trust, and control over the household's resources. Locks were simpler than today's, and keys were often large and heavy, but they served a vital purpose. The mistress of the house, be she the wife of a peasant with a small locked chest, a merchant's wife managing a substantial urban home, or the lady of a manor, was typically the keeper of the keys. These keys would open various locks within the home. Most importantly, they secured the storerooms where valuable commodities were kept. This included food supplies, like grains, flour, salted meats, dried fruits, spices, which were extremely valuable, and preserved vegetables. Keys also locked away barrels of ale or wine, protecting them from pilferage or unauthorized consumption. In an era where food security could be precarious and resources were hard-won, protecting these stores was paramount. The woman with the keys was responsible for rationing supplies, ensuring they lasted until the next harvest or market day, and preventing waste or theft by servants or even family members. She decided what would be used for the daily meals and what would be kept for special occasions or emergencies. Beyond, food keys might secure chests or coffers containing other valuables. This could include the family's best clothing, linen stores, sheets, tablecloths, important dowry items, any silver or pewterware tools, and perhaps even money or important documents if the family possessed them. In larger households, keys might also control access to certain rooms. Holding the keys signified that the woman was entrusted with the economic management of the domestic sphere. It was a role that required diligence, foresight, and honesty. The number and type of keys she carried could also reflect the household's wealth and status. More keys generally meant more to protect and manage. The loss of keys would have been a serious matter, potentially compromising the security of the household's entire stock of provisions and valuables. While her sphere of authority was largely domestic, the power of the keys gave the medieval woman significant control over the day-to-day running and material well-being of her family and household. It was a weighty responsibility, literally and figuratively. Number 6. The simple kirtle or gown. The fabric of a medieval woman's daily life was quite literally her kirtle or gown. This was the basic, all-purpose dress worn by women across different social classes, though with significant variations in material, cut, and decoration. For the vast majority, the kirtle was a practical garment made from sturdy, homespun wool, or in some cases linen, especially for summer wear or undergarments. The typical kirtle was a long dress, often reaching the ankles or floor, with long fitted or slightly flared sleeves. The construction was generally simple, based on T-shapes or using gores, triangular pieces of fabric, inserted into the skirt to give it fullness without wasting precious cloth. It might be slipped on over the head or fastened with lacing, either at the front, back, or sides. Buttons became more common in the later medieval period, but were initially a luxury. Underneath her kirtle, a woman would wear a chemise or shift, a simple loose-fitting undergarment, usually made of linen. This was her primary layer against the skin, protecting the outer kirtle from body oils and sweat, and could be more easily laundered than the heavier woolen outer garment. In colder weather, additional layers like overtunics, surcoats, or cloaks would be added for warmth. The colors of everyday kirtles were often derived from natural dyes available locally, resulting in shades of brown, gray, russet, muted greens, yellows, or blues. Brighter, more vibrant colors like deep reds or rich blues required more expensive dye stuffs and were usually seen on the clothing of wealthier individuals. A peasant woman or a working townswoman might own only one or two kirtles. These garments were worn day in and day out for all manner of chores, cooking, cleaning, childcare, fieldwork, spinning, and fetching water. They needed to allow for a range of movement, though the long skirts could sometimes be cumbersome. When a kirtle became torn or worn, it would be meticulously mended. Patches were common. Only when a garment was beyond repair would it be relegated to rags or perhaps repurposed into smaller items. While designed for utility, the kirtle also reflected social status. A noblewoman's kirtle would be made from finer wool, silk, or even brocade. It might be more elaborately tailored feature, more complex construction, longer trains, wider sleeves, and be richly embellished with embroidery or fur trim. However, for the ordinary medieval woman, her simple, durable kirtle was her work uniform, her daily attire, and a significant investment of material and labor. It was a garment made to last, a constant feature of her identity and her interaction with the world around her. Number 5. The keeper of all. Her wooden chest. For many medieval women, a sturdy wooden chest, sometimes called a coffer or an ark, was her most significant piece of furniture and her most private, secure space. In a world where personal possessions were few and living spaces often crowded and lacking in privacy, the chest served as a vital repository for her belongings, her dowry, and items essential to her household. These chests were typically constructed from thick planks of wood, such as oak or pine joined together. Simpler chests might be of basic plank construction, while more robust examples used the six-board method: a top, bottom, front, back, and two ends. Iron hinges allowed the heavy lid to open, and most chests would have at least one lock, often with a large iron keyhole plate to secure the contents. Some chests were plain and utilitarian, while those belonging to wealthier families might be carved, painted with scenes or patterns, or reinforced with decorative iron bands. What went inside this chest? For a bride, it would often hold her dowry items, the goods she brought to her marriage. This could include clothing, her best kirtles, shifts, head coverings, household linens, sheets, towels, tablecloths. If her family could provide them, linen was valuable. Perhaps some pewterware, a new set of tools specific to women's work, like needles, spindles, or even a distaff. The chest itself was often part of the dowry. Throughout her married life, the chest continued to be the storage place for the family's most valued textiles, any spare clothing, important documents if they existed, any small personal treasures, and perhaps even stored food items if no other secure place was available. It protected these goods from dust, damp, to some extent, as floors could be earthen, pests like moths and rodents, and casual theft. Some chests were designed with travel in mind, with handles on the sides, as people, especially of the noble and merchant classes, might move between residences or accompany their husbands on journeys. The marriage chest, in particular, was made to be transported from the bride's parental home to her new marital home. The chest was often placed in the main living area or in the sleeping chamber, if the house had one. It might also serve as a seat or even a makeshift table. More than just a storage box, it represented a woman's contribution to the marriage, her personal property within the shared household, and a link to her natal family. These chests were built to last and were often passed down through generations, becoming heirlooms that carried the history and memories of the women who had owned them. For a medieval woman, her wooden chest was a small bastion of personal space and security in a largely communal world. Number 4. The daily grind. Her quern stones. Bread was a fundamental staple of the medieval diet, from the coarsest peasant loaf to the finer manchets of the wealthy. Before that bread could be baked, however, the grain, wheat, rye, barley, or oats had to be ground into flour. While watermills and windmills became increasingly common throughout the medieval period, especially for lords of the manor or commercial bakers, the hand quern or quern stones remained a vital piece of equipment in many households, particularly in more remote areas or for families who preferred to process their own grain. And the laborious task of operating it almost invariably fell to women. A hand quern consisted of 2 circular stones. The bottom stone, called the bedstone or nether stone, was stationary and often slightly convex. The top stone or runner stone was heavier with a hole in its center, through which grain was fed. It also had a handle, usually wooden, fixed near its edge. The grinding surfaces of the stones were often dressed or grooved to help shear and crush the grain. The stones themselves were made from hard, durable rock, carefully chosen to avoid grit contaminating the flour. To use the quern, a woman would kneel or sit beside it. She would pour a small amount of grain into the central hole of the runner stone. Then, grasping the handle, she would begin the hard work of rotating the top stone against the bottom one. This action crushed and ground the grain between the two stones, and the resulting flour or meal would gradually work its way out from between the stones and collect on a cloth or tray placed around the base. Operating a hand quern was extremely physically demanding. The runner stone could be quite heavy, and turning it for hours on end to produce enough flour for a family's daily needs was back-breaking labor. It required strength, stamina, and persistence. The resulting flour was often coarse and might be sieved through a piece of cloth to separate out the bran and produce a finer flour, though for many the wholemeal product was standard. While lords who owned mills often tried to compel their tenants to use the manorial mill and pay a toll for the service, the hand quern offered a degree of independence. It allowed a family to process small quantities of grain as needed directly from their own harvest or stores. Alongside the quern, a woman might also use a mortar and pestle, typically smaller and made of stone or wood, for grinding smaller quantities of items, like herbs for cooking, or medicine, spices if she had them, or even pigments. But for the daily production of the staff of life, the rhythmic, strenuous turning of the quern stones was a sound and an effort familiar to countless medieval women. Number 3. The fiery heart, her cauldron. At the very center of most medieval homes, both literally and figuratively, was the hearth, the open fire used for heating and, crucially, for cooking. And suspended over this fire, or sitting steadily upon its embers, was the cauldron, the single most important cooking vessel in a medieval woman's kitchen. This was where the daily meals for the entire family were prepared. Cauldrons were typically made of metal. Cast iron or bronze were common materials, as they could withstand direct heat and were durable, though pottery cauldrons were also used, especially in earlier periods or by poorer households. They came in various sizes, from smaller pots for individual families to very large ones for great households or communal cooking. Most had a rounded belly, a wide mouth, and often 3 short legs to allow them to sit stably in the ashes, or a sturdy bale handle to suspend them from a hook or chain, a trammel or ratchet hook attached to a beam or an iron arm, a chimney crane, in later, more developed fireplaces, over the fire. The staple dish cooked in the cauldron was pottage. This was a thick, slow-cooked stew or porridge, the bedrock of the medieval diet. Its ingredients varied by season, region, and wealth, but typically included grains, barley, oats, wheat, beans or peas, and whatever vegetables were available from the garden or foraged. Onions, leeks, cabbage, carrots, turnips. If the family was fortunate, small amounts of meat, perhaps bacon, offcuts or game, or fish, might be added for flavor and sustenance. The pottage would simmer for hours over the fire, often being added to throughout the day. The cauldron was versatile. Besides pottage, it was used for boiling water, for other purposes, for washing, though not often for full baths, for laundry, a major undertaking, for brewing ale, a common household task for women, as ale was a safer drink than water in many places, or for scalding pigs or poultry during butchering. Managing the fire and the cauldron required skill and constant attention. The heat had to be regulated by adding or removing fuel, wood or peat, to prevent the contents from burning or boiling over. The smoky atmosphere of a medieval kitchen, often with no proper chimney but just a hole in the roof, meant that the woman tending the cauldron frequently worked in conditions that stung the eyes and filled the lungs. There was also the ever-present danger of scalds from boiling liquids or burns from the open fire, especially given the long flowing garments women wore. Cleaning the heavy, often soot-encrusted cauldron without modern detergents was another challenging task. Despite these difficulties, the cauldron was the warm, bubbling heart of the home, the source of nourishment and comfort, all under the diligent care of the medieval woman. Number 2. The thread of life. Distaff and spindle. Before a medieval woman could even think about sewing a garment or mending a tear, she first needed thread. And for much of the medieval period, especially for ordinary women, creating that thread was a painstaking, time-consuming process performed with two simple tools, the distaff and the spindle. The spinning wheel, while known in parts of Europe from the later 13th century, took time to become widespread and affordable. So for centuries, the hand spindle was queen. The distaff was essentially a staff, usually made of wood, ranging from a short stick to a longer pole. Its purpose was to hold the unspun mass of fibers, typically wool from sheep or flax fibers, for linen. The fibers were loosely wrapped or tied around one end of the distaff. The woman could then tuck the other end of the distaff into her belt, under her arm, or hold it, freeing up her hands to draw out and twist the fibers. The spindle was a straight stick, often thinner and shorter than the distaff, tapered at one or both ends. Near its bottom, it was fitted with a whorl, a small weighted disc made of stone, baked clay, bone, wood, or even lead. The whorl provided momentum and stability to the spindle as it spun, helping to twist the fibers into a continuous strand of yarn or thread. The process of spinning was an art learned from a young age. The spinner would draw out a few fibers from the mass on the distaff with one hand, gently teasing them out to the desired thickness. With the other hand, she would give the spindle a sharp twist, causing it to rotate. As it spun, often dropped towards the floor and allowed to hang and spin freely. It twisted the drawn-out fibers together, forming thread. The newly spun thread was then wound onto the shaft of the spindle. This process, drawing, twisting, winding, was repeated over and over again, hour after hour. Women spun constantly. It was a task that could be done almost anywhere, anytime. They spun while walking to market, while watching children, while tending livestock, or while sitting and chatting with other women in the evening. The phrase distaff-side came to refer to the female line of a family, highlighting how intrinsically linked spinning was to womanhood. The amount of thread needed to weave enough cloth for even a single garment was enormous. It has been estimated that it took many spinners to keep one weaver busy. A woman might spend a significant portion of her waking hours, year in and year out, engaged in this essential activity. The quality of the thread, its evenness and strength, depended on her skill. This thread was not just for her own family's clothing and household linens. Surplus thread or yarn could often be sold or bartered, providing a small but vital income. The distaff and spindle were thus more than tools. They were extensions of the medieval woman's hands, instruments of her economic contribution, and symbols of her unceasing industry. Number 1. The perilous passage. The birthing, stool, or bed. For a medieval woman, the journey into motherhood was one fraught with peril, a recurring passage that defined much of her adult life and carried a constant shadow of mortality. Childbirths almost always took place at home, within a familiar but not necessarily hygienic environment, attended exclusively by other women, female relatives, experienced neighbors, and, most importantly, a midwife. One object closely associated with this event was the birthing stool. Not every woman used one, as some gave birth in bed, kneeling, or squatting. But birthing stools were common, particularly in some regions. These were typically sturdy, U-shaped or open-fronted chairs, often low to the ground. This design allowed the laboring woman to sit in a semi-upright or squatting position, which could utilize gravity to aid delivery, and it gave the midwife better access to assist during the birth. These stools were sometimes owned by the midwife herself, who would bring it to the birthing chamber, or they might be a communal possession within a village. The birthing chamber was a strictly female space. Men, including physicians, who were rare and mostly served the very wealthy and even then were often hesitant to attend births directly, were generally excluded. The atmosphere would be one of intense activity, prayer, and folk remedies. Midwives relied on knowledge passed down through generations. Herbal concoctions to ease pain or hasten labor, massage, and physical maneuvering. There was no effective pain relief as we understand it today, beyond perhaps alcohol or certain herbs with sedative properties. The focus was on supporting the mother and guiding the baby's arrival. The risks were immense. Hemorrhage, excessive bleeding, was a major killer, difficult to control with the knowledge and tools available. Prolonged or obstructed labor could lead to the death of both mother and child, or result in devastating injuries like fistulas for the mother if she survived. Infection, in an era before antibiotics and with limited understanding of germ theory, was rampant. Puerperal fever, or childbed fever, claimed many lives in the days and weeks following delivery. Estimates vary, but maternal mortality rates were high. Perhaps 10 to 20 mothers died for every 1,000 births, and with women often having many pregnancies, the cumulative lifetime risk was substantial. Infant mortality was also tragically common, with many babies not surviving their first days or weeks. After a successful birth, if the mother survived, she would typically undergo a period of lying in or confinement for several weeks to recover. Later, she would participate in a churching ceremony, a ritual of purification and thanksgiving that marked her return to public life and the church community. The birthing stool, or the bed where she labored, stood as a silent witness to one of the most dangerous and profound experiences in a medieval woman's life, a cyclical event of creation shadowed by the ever-present possibility of death.